Today we have, let's say, a CSS special. We have Rachel with us talking about lots of interesting stuff. If you're an enthusiastic front-end developer like me, you will go crazy when you hear about container queries, for example, native masonry layout, aspect ratio, and lots of other stuff. Katarzyna, tell about Rachel a bit.
Okay, I'm here. Rachel Andrew is a front and backend web developer, an author and experienced speaker, author or co-author of 22 books, including the new CSS layout, and a regular contributor to a number of publications, both on and offline. Rachel is a member of CSS working group and currently works on MDN, documenting the web on behalf of Mozilla and Google. What she writes about business and technology on her own website. You can see that in rachelandrew.co.uk. Did I miss anything? Probably yes.
Rachel, you are muted.
Yes, I was just saying that I'm also on Twitter at Rachel Andrew, where I tend to post things, sometimes about the web, sometimes about cats.
Cats are good.
Sounds good. Okay, let's start, right? So we have quite some mute issues, I see.
Typical in this season.
Yeah, absolutely. So welcome again to our live stream. Before we directly give the stage to Rachel, Jose, maybe you want to tell a bit about our community to the audience.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for being here again, joining the YouTube channel. We have like a really exciting talk today. We are almost near of being on place. We don't know when, but we are almost, and we are excited to be in one place together talking about what we like. That is the front end. So hopefully we are going to be in a place in the couple in the next months. So don't forget to visit our website, follow us in the social network, and also subscribe in the meetup page to be aware of when our meetups are happening, and of course subscribe to the YouTube channel. So we are excited. So let's start with the talk. Richard, the stage is yours.
Before we start, actually, just one note. Please ask as many questions as you like, and as many as come in your mind. Post them in the YouTube chat. We will collect them, and after the talk, we'll go over them. And also, we have the Q&A session in YouTube after the talk. So stay with us after the talk. And yeah. As this is our final or the last event before a short summer break, I hope, we all hope that you enjoy this evening with Rachel, and we hope for a great conversation about lots of interesting CSS topics. So enjoy the evening, enjoy the day from wherever you called. And yeah, I would say, Rachel, now the stage is yours.
Okay, I can see my slides. That's a good start. Okay, well, hello. This is really a kind of quick run through of things that I think are interesting, things that have recently landed in browsers or that are coming soon. kind of the fun thing, I tweeted earlier when I put these slides together last night, and it's basically a slide deck that I have to do this sort of talk about coming soon to CSS. And every time I do it, I pull it out and I have a look and see which things are kind of a bit old now, they've been out for a while, and what new things have arrived, and which things that I've talked about before now actually have really good browser support. Because quite often I'll talk about something and I'll say, oh, you know, this is, you've got to enable flags to play with this, but do have a go. And then the next time I give the talk, it's actually shipped and it's landed in browsers. So that's kind of a nice thing about this slide deck. It's sort of like this little history of the web as things become enabled. So this is really where we are today. And there's a few things which are ready for you to use. They're in browsers, and there are some things which are behind flags and coming along soon, but they're there for you to play with. So this is the first thing. This is a bit of good news, because this, every time I do this talk, this has got better. In CSS Grid, we have the gap properties. We've got gap, column gap, and row gap, which let us do gutters between tracks. Column gaps also in multi-column has been there for years to create gaps between your columns. Now, you can use margins. You know, you can put a margin on your grid items and space things out. But the nice thing with the gap feature is you get gaps between your items and you don't get a gap on the outside. Now, with Flexbox, that's what we've had to do. If we've wanted to space out flex items, we've had to use margins. And then you have to do this thing where you sort of use a negative margin to take off the sort of outside margin that you end up with. You know, so you end up doing this kind of thing. And I'm sure most people who write CSS have got sites that have got this sort of code in there. And of course, you know, having the gap feature, immediately people started saying, well, it'd be great to have that in Flexbox. And the good news is that it now has landed. It's already in Chrome and Firefox, and it's going to be in Safari 15. So the next version of Safari will have the gap feature as well, which means that we can do things like that. You don't have to start adding margins to the children. You don't have to remove margins from the parent. You'll be able to have gaps between flex items and also between flex lines when you've got wrapped flex lines. So that's pretty neat. That's going to you know, make things a lot tidier. So this implements a few interesting things. I like talking about how CSS gets sort of made. And you might remember, if you were someone who jumped on the CSS Grid bandwagon really quickly, you might remember that that gap feature used to be called Grid Gap, Grid Row Gap, and Grid Column Gap. Now, they were shipped when Grid first appeared in browsers, and then kind of everyone looked at it and thought this could be useful elsewhere. And so it was renamed to just be gap, column gap, and row gap, so that it could be a bit more reusable rather than having to create a flex row gap, for example. They've actually been put into the box alignment specification, which has all of the alignment stuff which started life in Flexbox, actually, so things like justify content and so on. That's all in box alignment. So that specification deals with space distribution and alignment of things. So if you have the grid prefixed versions in your code, you don't need to worry. They've been kept as an alias of the properties, so sort of existing code won't break. But the new versions are implemented for grid in all browsers, so you can safely use those. So that's the gap property there. You know, in browsers. You might think, well, I have people with older browsers coming along. Can we detect that with feature queries? Use feature queries to test for support, you know, using, you know, a margin as a fallback. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't work very well. And that's kind of the second thing that this gap feature in Flexbox highlights about CSS. You can't do this with feature queries, because what feature queries do is they test for a name and a value. So if I want to test for grid support, I say at supports display grid. Hey, browser, do you support display grid? And all that is doing is seeing if the browser can parse display grid. You know, does the browser know what that is? Because we kind of know with CSS, if a browser doesn't know what something is, it just ignores it. And so it's kind of that check. It's sort of, do you understand this? We can't do that because with gap, if you say at supports gap 20 pixels, well, gap is supported very well in grid. And so the browser is going to say, yep, I support that, but it doesn't support it in Flex Layout. So this is a bit of an issue. I did raise this on the CSS working group to ask if it was something that could potentially be solved. But because of the sort of simple nature of those feature queries, it can't really. So that's just something to be aware of. It's probably not something that's going to come up too often in the future, this sort of partial implementation of things. But that's something that is a little bit of a shortcoming of feature queries. So something else, I like all these little things that fix problems that we've had for a very long time. I've been building websites since before CSS was a thing, so I've seen all of the problems. And here's something that just solves a really little problem that we might have. It means you can target the list bullet and change its color or size. So that didn't used to be possible. You'd have to target the whole content. You'd end up doing things like wrapping a span around your text so you could change the color. So this is how marker works. So here I'm changing the first child marker to black. I've got white text. So we end up with something like this, and we don't need to go and wrap a span around our text in order to make a different color to the bullet. It seems simple, and it's something we just haven't been able to do. This is supported in Chrome and Firefox. It is partially supported in Safari. Safari will let you do this example, but because it supports color and font size on the bullet. In Chrome and Firefox, they support a sort of newer version of the spec, and you can use other things. And an interesting thing you can use is the content property. So you can do things like this. I can say I can turn a heading into a list item, which is absolutely fine to do if you want to, which will give it a bullet. And then I can target the bullet and turn it into a broccoli, if that's what I want, with an emoji. You can put an emoji in there or anything, any other type of content that you want. So that gives you something like this. The nice thing about turning something into a list item is you get that sort of hanging text off the side of the rest of the content, which might be quite nice. So that's something you can do. Obviously, it's going to end up falling back to a plain bullet if you're in, say, Safari, which doesn't support the content property for marker. And kind of sticking with this theme of things that have been an absolute pain for years, aspect ratios. We have things which have an aspect ratio that we might embed into our pages. Images have an aspect ratio, and video embedded directly with HTML5 video has an aspect ratio, and it displays fine. We don't squish it or stretch it. That's absolutely fine. The problem comes when you want to embed a video from, say, YouTube, and you would like the width of that video to be stretchy and to fit with your responsive design, and you'd like the height to be the same aspect ratio. And this has been incredibly difficult to do. The way that I think most people currently deal with this is what we call the padding hack. This uses the fact that padding in the block direction is copied from the inline direction when we use a percentage. Now, that's not a very elegant solution to the problem. It's the sort of thing that if you're teaching someone CSS, you'd have to say, aha, this is how we do this strange thing. And it's very odd. And yes, it does work. There are a few places where you might have problems if you do it, but I mean, and that article explains some of them. But that's what we've been doing for a long time. So we're now going to have this aspect ratio in CSS in order for us to be able to sort of solve this problem. And it works really nicely. It seems very straightforward when you look at the code. So here I've got a grid layout. I'm doing the thing with grid here where you repeat as many tracks as will fit in. So they've got a minimum size of 250 pixels, but their maximum size is 1 FR. So they could be a bit bigger than 250 pixels and probably will be, depending on how much space they've got. And what I'd like to have are nice square boxes. Now, without the aspect ratio unit, I'd probably have to kind of guess how big those boxes were going to be. But if I make all my child items have an aspect ratio of 1:1, and then I've used a transform to turn them just for fun, I get something like this. So that's using the aspect ratio to set the height to be the same as the width. And that gives us square boxes. So there's lots of little use cases this is going to solve, as well as the obvious video one. This is now shipped in Chrome and Firefox and is coming to Safari. So this is something that we'll be able to start to use. Because it's a property with a value, you'll be able to use feature queries to check if it's there and fall back, say, to the padding hack if it's not. Also, it is time to put the width and height back onto your images in your HTML again. We kind of stopped doing that because of responsive design, and we didn't really need to. We were setting it in CSS. If you set a width and a height on your images, what will happen is the browser internally uses aspect ratio to leave the correct sort of space for that image as it's loading in. And this will help to stop layout shift as your site is loading, because you get that thing, you know, particularly on mobile, you start scrolling and then all the images start to load in, everything jiggles around, and that's miserable. This will help stop that happening, or stop that layout shift. So, you know, do start to add width and height back onto your properties and then override it with CSS, because the aspect ratio will be deduced from that. Okay, so these things are a bit newer and aren't things that you can really start to use right now, but you might be able to test out and see what's happening. So we've got some new color functions. There's a ton of interesting stuff happening with CSS color. I've just picked out a couple of things, but we've also got, you know, new kinds of color, ways to specify color, like, you know, lab and LCH, and there's just a lot of interesting stuff happening. I think that with Sass, you know, a lot of people were using Sass to figure out, you know, colors and make things lighter and darker and so on. And it's that kind of stuff that is actually coming to CSS. And of course, the advantage of doing it in CSS is it can react in real time rather than happening at compile time. So let's have a look at a couple of these. These things are, I think, just at the moment in Safari Technology Preview. Color mix, I believe, is behind a flag in Firefox, but this stuff changes all the time as these things get implemented. So this is color mix. It lets you mix two colors. So the percentage is how much of the first color you would like mixed in with the second. So that's quite good fun. You know, I think similar to things that people were doing in Sass. So you can sort of mix in more of the blue color and, you know, you get more of that color mixed in. That's just a nice little function. I think that's going to be really useful. There's also color contrast, and what this lets you do is compare a list of colors against a base color, and the browser will then select the color which gives the most contrast. Now, as someone who's worked a lot with content management systems, so this could be really useful if you're allowing people to, say, set a background color. You could then have a list of other colors to test against that and give the most contrasty version, for example. So I think this would be pretty useful. It even works with CSS variables. So I think, again, you know, color contrast, very, very handy for making sure that your stuff has as good contrast as possible, particularly if you've got kind of content being submitted by other people or even other developers. You know, you can have things set up so that generally good choices will happen. I think that's pretty neat. So do look at what's happening with color. And there's, you know, there's all sorts of stuff coming, and it's, you know, it's such fun to play with as well. So, you know, do have a look at that stuff. So, masonry. When Grid first launched, a lot of people thought this will let us do masonry. And some demos look a bit like that. You can certainly make something that looks like it's doing masonry in Grid, but Grid isn't really masonry. And to kind of understand this, you need to know what masonry layout is if you've not ever built one. The typical thing is like on Pinterest, you know, so what you have is a layout which lays things out by row. So the sort of logical order of the things is across the row. But then when you get to the next row, if there's a gap, the items will push up. So if you've got a tall item with a short item, when you get to the next row, the second item will sort of push its way up to display nice and neatly. So you get this nicely tightly packed set of items. It's not really a grid though. It's kind of a sort of a hybrid of grid and flexbox almost. You know, you've got that sort of squishing things in both dimensions. So it's a common layout. It's pretty expensive to do with JavaScript, particularly if you've got a lot of items. So it's something that people would like to be able to do you know, without using JavaScript. So this is coming to level 3 of the grid spec. So essentially what we're doing here is we're defining a masonry layout for one axis of the grid. So you do your normal grid on columns, probably. It works both ways because things in grid try and work in both dimensions. But typically, you will want your columns to be the axis that you set. So here we're setting up 4 columns. And then you say for your rows, use masonry. So use this masonry keyword. And so that means that the grid is going to lay your rows out with a masonry formatting rather than a normal grid formatting. That is an example of a masonry layout using this technique. This works in Firefox nightly, so that's the browser that has this. You need to enable that very long thing. If you go to the flags and search for masonry, you'll find it. You can enable it, and then you can have a play around with masonry. It works really nicely. It kind of works as you'd expect. You know, and you can do all the other grid-like things. I wasn't a huge fan initially of it going into the grid spec because it isn't the grid, but it does let you do some of the grid stuff, so you can span things and so on, and still have it all working, which I think is pretty cool. I did write up some of that stuff on Smashing Magazine, so you can have a look and see how it all works. I think my one kind of caveat with masonry layout in grid and with, well, anything that allows you to change the order of stuff, you need to be pretty careful in terms of accessibility, because you could well end up with things in an odd sort of organization for someone who is tabbing through the content, you know, using their keyboard. So that's the thing you have to start testing quite carefully. But it's the same really with regular grid. You know, you can move things around and put things out of order. So I think with any of these things, you need to take care that you're not creating a really poor experience for people who are keyboard navigating, because it's quite easy to do. So that's masonry. I don't know when that will be out from behind a flag at the moment, or when it'll get into other browsers, but it's the sort of thing you can go and have a play with and maybe offer some feedback. If you are using masonry layouts a lot, then you might have some feedback and say, well, actually, this thing that we often do doesn't work. This is a good time to talk about that to browser vendors and to the CSS working group, because it's hidden behind a flag at the moment. We can make changes to it. And so along the same lines, really, this is subgrid, which is actually grid level 2, defines subgrid. Again, Firefox sort of shipped this. It's not even behind a flag, it's just available in Firefox. This is the subgrid value of grid template columns and grid template rows. What this lets you do is inherit your grid. You make a parent grid, and then you put a child item on it. You give the child item display grid, and then you can say grid template columns, for example, subgrid, and it will use the tracks that it's spanning over rather than defining its own tracks. So it essentially allows you to kind of inherit the grids all the way down. I've talked a lot about subgrid in other talks. I'm not going to go into it in too much depth. If you want to play with subgrid examples, there's a load of them on my Grid by Example site. There's lots of people have been writing and doing examples of it. But if you've ever been in a situation where you've laid some things out in your grid and say you've got some cards and you're like, I wish all the footers could line up, subgrid's going to solve that kind of problem, and probably lots of others. So hopefully that is something we're going to be able to use soon. As I say, it's not behind a flag in Firefox, and it is being worked on over at Edge. The Edge team are working on it for Chromium. So one of the sort of things that's kind of held this up, because obviously it's been around on the horizon for quite a while, but it hasn't happened in Chrome. And that's because it's kind of been behind this new layout engine new rendering engine that's been written for Chromium. And so Grid itself needed re-implementing in this new code so that everything could then work with the new rendering engine. So that kind of obviously held up subgrid, because no one was going to put the work in to implement subgrid on the old rendering engine. They were going to wait till the new one came along. So the team at Microsoft Edge have been working on that. This is from a blog post last year when they mentioned they were doing so. I mean, the Edge team are perfect to work on it because they actually were the ones who, it was the Microsoft team who brought us Grid in the first place. The early implementations were in Internet Explorer. So that's really great. And I know that that is all well underway. As part of Rendering NG, which is basically this whole project, a multi-year effort. It's been a huge effort to improve the rendering engine. That makes a lot of things possible, like Subgrid. It also fixes a whole ton of bugs and so on. There's a lot of stuff that you find annoying in the web platform. Is annoying not because browser vendors don't care about it. It's annoying because it's very, very hard to fix. And that might be just because it's like touches really old code. So Rendering NG and Layout NG, that is going to make a lot of things that we've been wanting possible, and also just make things faster and better and more fit for the future. So that's pretty good. Part of that blog post there goes into quite a lot of detail, but isn't overly technical. I think it's an interesting read if you want to know about what goes into this sort of work. And one part of that was Tables NG, which shipped in Chrome recently, and you may have seen people sort of tweeting about that. So that's enabled one of these things. So having fixed headers on a table. Tables are quite an old bit, obviously, of CSS and HTML, and they were never particularly well spec'd. And so because of that, there's sort of a lot of issues and bugs and things that come up with tables because the spec was very vague, and so browsers implemented it in different ways, and a lot of stuff that just needed fixing in browsers to make it work well. So that's sort of happened, which means that things like those sticky headers will work, and I think we'll start to see a whole bunch of stuff land, fixes and also new features, as this all gets rolled out. So that's pretty exciting and something to look forward to. So here's something completely different. This prefers reduced data, which is a media feature. Now, what prefers reduced data does is it allows CSS to check if the visitor has enabled data saving in their device. At the moment, it's only in Chrome Canary. But what this lets you do then, if someone has enabled data saving, they probably don't want to download big things right now. And so you can be nice to them and not download stuff, images, web fonts, whatever, because they've asked for that. As I say, that's currently in Chrome Canary. So it would work like this. Basically, you're checking to see if they haven't got a preference. If they've made no preference, then you can download those images because they haven't got data saving turned on. So again, just a nice way to be kind to your users and to look at what preferences they've set, because it's not much good looking at whether they're on a phone, because they might be on a phone at home with their Wi-Fi connection. You don't know. Or they might be on their laptop, but like on a train on terrible Wi-Fi. So, sort of seeing what they would like is really useful. Download Chrome Canary. I think it's behind experimental web platform features. You can emulate a person browsing with data saving enabled. This is something I really like, the fact that a lot of the new stuff that we're getting into the web platform, as well as the thing itself being shipped, there's some dev tools get shipped along with it to make it easier for us to test it. Because a lot of these things, particularly things like preferences and so on, are quite tricky to test. You might not have a device to hand that you could test them with. So this is one of what we call a user preference media feature. So it's part of Media Queries Level 5. And really, a lot of this stuff is about more than just looking at screen size. That kind of worked in the early days of responsive design when you were on a phone or on a big screen sat at home at your desktop. And of course, there's everything in between these days in terms of sizes of device, but also in terms of where we are when we're using them. And so these sort of user preferences help us to look at what people would like. And so things like things that have already been shipped, like prefers reduced motion, to find out if someone has asked for less motion because it perhaps, makes them feel nauseous or whatever. Or they might have asked for dark mode, and you can react to that. So there's lots and lots of these things. And they're just another way for you to, to sort of tailor the experience to the user. And they may not be relevant for all sites, but for certain sites and web applications, they can be really handy because you're actually then looking at what the user wants rather than guessing something about their environment when you don't really know. So I think they're really cool. And I think we'll see more of that sort of stuff. So this is something you can't try out, but it's cool and I wanted to include it. So this is leading trim. It's really just in discussion at the moment. Now what this does is lets you trim off the extra space around text. I'm pretty sure, most of us have run into the situation where perhaps we're using different fonts. And one font seems to have masses of space above and below it, and the other one doesn't have very much. And there's not a lot you can do about that. You end up just sort of trying to align things and nudge them around to make it look okay. Letting trim will let you remove that space, basically, which will make sort of aligning things an awful lot easier. So this is how it's sort of proposed to look at the moment. So we're trimming the text from the top and the bottom of the box. I'm not going to go too much into this to say it's not something you can test out yet, but this article is excellent. It has lots and lots of examples. It explains why we have the problem in the first place, what the sort of historical reasons for this are. And it sort of explains, how it could potentially work. It's something that I think, the working group would be very happy to hear feedback on because it's in that sort of early stage where gathering feedback is something that we can do. So do have a look at that. And I think that's, again, one of those things that will solve a bunch of problems that we've had. And so if I stay with fonts, something that you can start to use and has sort of just rapidly kind of appeared in browsers, we've got what we call font face descriptors. So when you are, including a font, you can add various sort of properties to tell it how to behave. We call those descriptors. So we've got some new descriptors: size adjust, ascent override, descent override, and line gap override. Now, what these let you do is they let you sort of change things about a font to help it match other fonts. Now, this is really useful because when we're using web fonts, we typically specify a fallback font, which is something which is likely to be on the user's computer. And so that fallback font loads immediately and you can see the text. And then the web font loads in and everything jiggles around because the web font is never going to be the same size as the local font. You can try really hard to match the two, but there's always going to be something that's different. It might be, the space above or below, it might be the size of it, what have you. So that's what these are to do. They're to basically let you tweak the sizing of a font to match another one, or you could just tweak the sizing of it because you think it looks better. It's up to you. Size adjust will be in the next version of Chrome, and it's behind a flag in Firefox. The others are shipped in Chrome and Firefox. So we can have a quick look at how those work. So we're loading, a local Arial font, and we are making the size, doing it a percentage smaller, making the ascent override a bit bigger. We're playing around with the sizes so that when we load in our web font, hopefully they're going to match. So we can just sort of tweak those around. The ascent override changes the space above the font, what they call the ascent metric. Descent override is the bit below the font, and then line gap override are your gaps. So it's probably a case of having a bit of a play around and seeing, what matches the best, but they're something you can use. There's no reason not to use them. They'll just be ignored if they're not supported by the browser. So that's something you can do to try and help a bit with that layout shift as fonts are loading in. And then container queries. I've sort of often do talks and ask people, what features are you most keen to see in CSS? And for like about the last 10 years, maybe, it's always been container or element queries. So for those that maybe haven't come across this problem, media queries will act, in terms of size, will act on the viewport. So how big is my entire screen? and let you change things based on that size. If you're working, particularly if you're working with components, you might build, a little component, that little card component that you would like to display the items side by side if you've got lots of space, but a narrow view you want to display stacked. That's something that's really hard to do because it's probably where you've put the component is what's dictating its size, not the size of the actual screen. Flexbox and Grid let you get some of the way towards this kind of thing. If you use Flexbox and Grid, you can use some of the sort of the way you can have, as many columns that will fit and so on to, maybe simple examples like, is it side by side or stacked? You can get that to work. But there's lots of places where really you need to be able to target the container that the component is in. You want its size to base your responsiveness on, not necessarily the whole screen. So that's what this seeks to solve. There's a lot of history about this. It's been something that for a long time, browser vendors were saying, we can't do this. We can't do this in a performant way because we need to kind of know too much of the environment before we can lay anything out, and that's going to be expensive. It's going to make things slow. So this is one of the things that rendering ng in Chrome is enabling, is that it sort of became possible, and also due to a bunch of work by a lot of clever people, particularly Miriam Suzanne has been doing the sort of editing work on this and doing lots and lots of work on this specification. We are going to get container queries. It's not something that's in browsers shipping yet, but if you use Chrome Canary, you can enable the container queries flag and you can play around with it. So this is just a simple example. This may well change. We're using the contain property, which is an existing property, which essentially says that everything inside this thing that's got contain, if you say contain layout, you're saying the layout of this thing is independent. It's not going to be changed by anything around it, which is useful for performance. And that's what contain was designed for initially, was as a performance feature. If you've got a site where you're doing lots of stuff with JavaScript, like a single page app, you can sort of say, well, this area of the page never gets repainted or relaid out. And so the browser can kind of ignore it when it's making those decisions, rather than having to go, down the whole tree in every component to do relayout or repaint. So using an existing property, that enables some stuff. And here we're basically saying that we're looking at the inline size, and then we use a container query and we're targeting the container. So whatever that thing's in, its nearest container, rather than the viewport. It seems really quite simple, put like that. There's obviously an awful lot of complexity and work to get that to work in browsers. But I think that once that lands, I think a lot of people are going to be very happy, and I'll be glad not to be asked that question about it again. But yeah, I think that's a very exciting thing, I think, for the web platform. And it kind of shows how these big efforts to improve browsers that often seem like everything's slowed down a bit because this big engineering effort's happening, they then start to unlock features that we've been asking for forever. So I've been documenting this. There's quite a lot of people writing about this because obviously it's super exciting for people. I'm trying to keep this page over on MDN up to date as things change. And eventually that will become, once we've got a sort of a solid spec, that will become the MDN docs for container queries. It's a bit early to fully document yet because things are going to change. So that's kind of my roundup of stuff. And really where I wanted to go from here is to say a little bit about how to get involved with this stuff yourself, because a lot of the things that I'm sort of showing you haven't really come from the CSS working group sitting in a room and saying, "Hi, you know what would be cool if we did this," because that's not really how the CSS working group work. I mean, sometimes someone will come and say, "Hey, it would be great if we had this feature, and I think we could do it," but a lot of the time, features come from outside. They come from web developers. They might come from a browser vendor as well. They might come from a browser vendor saying, hey, look, we need this to help performance or so on, or people are finding this thing difficult and we'd like to be able to make it better. But a lot of features come from what do web developers actually need? What are they trying to do? What are they doing with JavaScript? How can we make this stuff easy? And while there's lots of people who are looking at what people are asking for and looking at the questions, sometimes, you can just sort of let the working group know that there's things that you're interested in. And anyone can get involved with this stuff. I'm a CSS working group advised expert, but I started, raising issues and sort of asking questions before that point. And really anyone can get involved with this stuff. You don't need to have any special permission granted. You don't need to be a representative of a browser. You can just kind of come along and get involved. There's a really nice site, this WPC guide, which kind of goes into a lot of depth really into the different ways to contribute to the platform. I'm going to mention a few of them here, but if you're interested in stuff that you can do, this is a really good place to start. Now, really a very easy way to get involved, and something I would suggest everyone does. If you are looking at these new things that I'm mentioning, or you see someone on Twitter talking about a feature and you think that sounds cool, but I'm not sure it's going to solve the problems I've got, you can come and you can comment on that. So we have all of our issues at that URL. That's the CSS Working Group draft repository and issues. Some of those issues look incredibly complicated, but other ones are just, what should we call this thing? And some of them are essentially just saying, I think it would be good if we had a feature like this, and just talking about what the use cases are. So you can come along and you can comment on the existing issues, and sometimes I'll mention something and say, hey, look, there's an issue here. We could do some comments on that. So here's something I raised ages ago, the ability to target items in the nth row of an auto-filled grid. So that's something I raised. It's not something that's been dealt with yet, but a bunch of people thought it was quite a good idea. When you sort of, you're showing this stuff, what is really, really useful to do is to come up with a use case, because there's kind of lots of stuff that would be cool. We can all think of like features that would be kind of cool. But like with any product, and the web platform is just a big product, with any product, the things you're most likely to implement are the ones where you can see there's lots of use cases for them. So that might just be writing up an issue you had with a project. We wanted to do this and grid didn't work for us because it might be that you've had to write JavaScript to get around some problem. So, we ended up needing to use JavaScript to get these things to line up, and it seems like this should work, so you can show that example. If a feature would improve on something that we already do, but you think that it could be done, in CSS in a better way, explain that. So it's kind of explaining why we need this thing, as opposed to just this thing would be cool. The other thing about those kind of issues is that often other people will jump in on them because someone else will see it and be like, oh yeah, I had that problem too, and they'll add their thoughts. So they can be quite a good way of getting the working group to know there is need for it. Because most people on the CSS working group aren't actually web developers, or we were web developers. We don't really build websites that much anymore. So having those use cases from people who are building websites every day, really, really useful. If something, any suggestion will need discussion, unless you're just saying, hey, there's a typo in that spec, and those reports are absolutely fine too. But unless you're just saying that, if it's not like an editorial change can just be made. Anything that actually needs a change to a specification will be discussed by the CSS working group at some point. And when it is, what we do, we have our meetings and we log into IRC. That's sort of one of the things with the DWI3C, you have to use IRC sometimes. Our meetings are all minuted in IRC, and then the minutes are then posted back to the issue they relate to, which is pretty cool, which means you can go and you can see what was said. So you can see if it was resolved and we're like, yes, that should be added to a spec. You can see if people are like, oh, I think we need more information about that. Or if it was actually rejected for whatever reason. But things aren't just, oh, we're not doing that. It'll be, this would be too difficult to implement. This would, cause this other problem. There'll be some explanation. And you can always comment back and ask questions. People really don't mind that at all. What I would say is that it can take a lot longer than you think for changes to be made. Your issue will not be forgotten. We don't close things until they've been discussed, but it might be that nobody is working on that specification right now. If you start perusing the issues, you'll realize there's actually a very few people from the CSS working group doing this stuff. So it can take a while for things to come up. And especially at the moment, it's sometimes quite hard as a working group to discuss some of these things remotely, like we've been doing. You know, we want to get around a whiteboard and talk about them. So silence doesn't mean your stuff's ignored. It is a long game. So, you know, do raise issues, but don't sort of feel like you're being ignored if they're not immediately discussed. You might be lucky, it might be a spec everyone's working on. If you see a lot of activity or if working group members are tweeting about it, it's quite likely we're actually after sort of input right now, and it'll come up quite quickly. But yeah, you know, please be patient. You're not being ignored. It's just kind of how it is. Something that can get results pretty quickly, not always, but sometimes, is to raise browser bugs. So that might be a browser bug, could be something that needs fixing. So, hey, Firefox, you're doing something different to what the spec says, or you're doing something different to this other browser. And it might be asking for a feature. If there's not a bug in the bug repo for a certain feature that's in a CSS spec, you know, you could raise an issue to have it implemented. So this is really important because obviously we can write about CSS as much as we want in specifications, but we need browsers to implement them in order to use them. So, you know, do raise issues if you find them. Lots of CSS has been shipped really quickly. Some of it's going to have bugs because that is software development. If you want to raise an issue, so for instance, you found something behaving differently in Chrome and Firefox, don't just point to your website where you saw the issue, because it might be that an engineer doesn't look at that for 6 months because they're busy or they're working on some other part of the engine. And then by the time they come back, you've probably changed your website. So if you want to report a bug, make a reduced test case. So the simplest way you can show that bug with as little code as possible that would still reproduce the bug, and put it somewhere. Either upload the files to the bug or put it on Codepen or, you know, JSBin or whatever, somewhere where it's like a permanent record, so that even if a year later the engineer goes along, it's going to be the same. And also by removing all the other stuff that's on your site, it's going to be much easier for them to be able to look at. So do that. And then, you know, go to the bug tracker. There's bug trackers for all of the browsers, and you can post your bug. And don't worry too much if you're not sure, like, who's got it wrong. You know, if you raise a bug and say, you know, this is different in Firefox, this is different in Chrome to other browsers, it might turn out that actually, you know, that browser is correct as to the spec and the issue is with a different browser. But, you know, these people are all talking to each other, and nobody wants interoperability problems. It could be actually the spec needs adjusting. So don't be worried about posting stuff and thinking, oh, I might have blamed the wrong browser, because nobody minds about that. It'll get sorted out. They'll decide it's not them, and someone will ping someone on the other team. So don't worry about raising this stuff. And then all these things I've shown you that are behind flags, please try them out. It's really hard to get people to try things behind flags. And then once they've landed in browsers, it's hard to make changes. So if something that you care about, like container queries, is behind a flag, you know, please look at the stuff you're doing and say, will this solve my use case? You know, write some example code if you've got time, or try out the examples that are out there on the web and really think, you know, will this solve the problems that I've got? Because once things get out there, they're very, very difficult for us to change. We all know about the things that have got weird names or behave in strange ways compared to everything else. The CSS working group have made a list of them. We know about them. We know they exist. And we can't do anything about them until we invent time travel. We'd really like to not add to this list. You can help us do that by testing out things while they're behind a flag. Yeah, that list's quite good, actually. That explains quite a few of the things that you're like, why is this like this? Why did the CSS working group do it? And it's like, because we just didn't know how things would go in the future. If you are someone who likes writing JavaScript, who likes writing tests, and I think there's a subset of people who like writing tests. And if you like writing tests, you can actually write tests for the web platform. So we've got something called web platform tests. And what this does is it allows us to test, it allows browsers to test that they are complying with the specs. As a spec editor, if I make a change to a spec that's, you know, implemented in browsers, you're supposed to also have a test. The browsers use that test suite to check that they are complying with the spec. If the spec changes, then that means they're going to light up like they're not complying with it, and they have to go and change it. So this is really great. There's lots of CSS hasn't got tests yet. So if you're into writing tests, this is a very, very good way to contribute and help the web platform. And it's kind of, there's some quite interesting stuff to poke around at. As a docs writer, I often look at the tests to help me understand how things work, if I'm not quite sure, because actually seeing how it's tested. And if you are someone who wants to get involved with the platform, starting by writing tests is a very good way, because you have to understand something to be able to test it. So that's something you can get involved with. So that's kind of a bunch of things. And yeah, you know, kind of, I'm sort of reasonably well known in this web world, and a lot of that has just been because I've kind of contributed to stuff, and by contributing stuff, I've learned about it. I've learned so much about CSS by, you know, getting involved, teaching other people, getting involved with the working groups, and so on. You know, you can learn a lot by doing that. It's an interesting world to be involved with, and you can sort of feel like you're just helping to make things a little bit better for web developers that come after, which is, I think, pretty neat. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's take a look. We have some questions.
Cool.
Let's see. Okay, so one question, I'll show it here, is about the Flexbox. Is there no workaround around this Flexbox?
Now, I did see someone
madness?
doing something with JavaScript, and you could probably do something with JavaScript to detect it. It's a real shame. I mean, you know, I think it's not something that's going to come up too much in the future. It's kind of a, you know, just sort of because of the order in which things shipped, and which, you know, it's sort of a bit unfortunate that we ended up with this sort of partial implementation. So yeah, there's not a good CSS way around it, unfortunately. As I say, you could probably do something with JavaScript if it was that important, but I think it's probably one of those things we just kind of have to live with until it goes away, and it'll go away reasonably quickly. With the speed that, you know, browsers are updating and so on, that people update their browsers these days, it's not as bad as it used to be.
I really like your thought, Rachel. Thanks for the inspiration and for all your words. As you mentioned, the contribution, grow as communities, as professional, as a person, is like a long-term process. And thanks for encouraging us to be brave and help each other. The technology is very novel, and no matter where are you can contribute. Thank you so much.
Yeah. It's also nice to see that it's really easy nowadays to contribute, and that the contribution is really welcomed by browser vendors and by the working group, and basically we are all like working together. Like before one feature is, I think, considered stable in a browser, you in the working group basically need feedback from like early adopters in the web developers scene, if things work as planned according to the spec, right? So I mean,
that's it. I mean, you know, browsers aren't competing on these features. You know, generally, you know, all of the browsers kind of want things to work in a standard way, because it's not helpful to anyone to have one browser doing something different. You know, that's just not.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, yeah, I mean, for a spec to kind of progress and become, you know, what we'd call a web standard, we have to have two different implementations of it. So at least two browsers have to have landed that thing and it work in the same way. That's kind of, so, you know, there's a lot of effort to try and make sure these things work in the same way, and are reliable, and also that they meet the needs that people have, because that's kind of why we're doing it, you know. Sort of.
Many people in the chat is saying thank you also.
Yes, you don't see it currently. Lots of thanks, yeah, for the talk. It was really nice. So here's another concrete question. If setting an aspect ratio overrides, does setting an aspect ratio override an image ratio if the width and height attributes were set on it?
If you gave an image an aspect, I don't know. I don't think I've ever tried to do it. I'd have to look that up. I'm sure the spec defines it. But yes, because you could set the aspect ratio on an image, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure it's defined in the spec.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm trying to think why you'd want to do that. But yeah, I'd have to check that. I guess it might do. Because you're actually saying that you want that. Because if you had it on if your image is a grid item, for example, you might want to change the ratio. I'm not sure what the default is. But yeah, it should be defined in the spec. We don't tend to stretch things by default, but then if you are asking for that to happen, well, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, it's always a balance, like what gets the highest priority, like.
Yeah, I mean, but by default, generally images don't. Anything it's got its own aspect ratio, you kind of want to preserve that, which is why if you've got like an image as a grid item, it will align to start rather than stretch by default. So that means that by default, an image as a grid item isn't going to get stretched out of space. I mean, if you want to stretch it, you can do, but by default, we don't stretch things. So generally, things with an aspect ratio. But yeah, I don't offhand know the answer to that. I'm sure it's in the spec though.
Peter's asking about the current browser support for container queries.
Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, it's still at a relatively early stage in terms of a specification. Obviously, Chrome have got an experimental implementation, which is always a good sign because if someone can ship it, it's actually working. There tends not to be a roadmap, particularly for features, just because it touches quite a lot of stuff. There's a lot to be worked out. So you'll not normally get a browser vendor saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to ship that next year." I mean, Grid took years. I mean, I was saying that Grid was coming on stage for like about 4 years before it landed. I mean, it was like I was starting to feel like I was talking about vaporware. I know it is honestly coming, and you're sort of like, and sort of 5 years later it shipped. So yeah, I mean, these things can take a long time. I don't think this is something we're going to be using in the very soon future, particularly in terms of cross-browser. But it is certainly, there's a lot of, every working group call, we have a weekly call, every working group call, there are issues on container queries discussed. And there's a lot to work out and it's being worked out. So yeah, I mean, I really hope that it won't be too long, but it's very difficult to put timescales on these things.
Yeah, in my opinion, container queries also are like one of the biggest features we had in the last 10 years, right? So there were breakpoints, and then now we have container queries like a next milestone, which give more granularity, let's say, to control the display of an element, just than only the viewport, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a feature that's incredibly high priority, and and it's being actively worked on. If you follow the issues, you can see that happening. So yeah, it's happening. There's a lot of stuff to do with all of these things.
Yeah.
Let's see. We have another question here. Speaking a lot of items, how would native masonry support virtual scrolling, theoretically?
Virtual scrolling. So I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think he means that only the part which is visible in the screen is being rendered. And if native masonry layout would like also ease the pain of the rendering of large large items. I'm not sure if this was the direction of the question, but
yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it certainly should work with all of the scrolling stuff that's specified. And there's all sorts of stuff with scrolling that's kind of recently happened. I'm not sure there's anything specific about it. Oh, right. Okay. So not rendering all the items really visible. Yeah, I mean, that should generally work because it is just grid really. And grid works like that. So yeah, virtual scrolling in terms of not rendering all the items but the visible ones. So yes, that should work, I would have thought, because it works with grid. And that's the nice thing about sort of the way that masonry is tied into grid, is that things should generally kind of work as you expect. That sort of thing is the sort of thing to test as well, because you should, if you've got something like that working in a grid layout, it's going to be pretty simple to just change the row axis to be masonry and see if it still works. And if it doesn't work, that's a really good bug to raise, because it probably should. It should work, it should work in logical ways. If you've got stuff that works in grid and doesn't work in masonry, that would be a really good thing to raise at this point.
Yeah. I think we've picked all questions. Maybe give the audience maybe 1-2 minutes to answer to raise some more questions. And yeah, what I would be interested in, like, how does a normal working group day look like, basically? I'm totally curious. Like, are you just how do you reproduce stuff, or what's on the agenda? How often do you meet? How many people are there? How many browser vendors are there, and how many just web workers are there? Like,
well, I mean, obviously, yeah. I mean, things have been a bit different since COVID, but kind of how it works is we have a weekly telephone meeting, sort of, just audio. That's every week. 3 of those are in a time zone that works for Europe, and 1 of them is in a time zone that works better for people like in Japan and those sort of areas, because those people have to get up in the middle of the night all the time. And so we have those every week. We have the telephone conference. That's an hour, and then before COVID, we would have 3 or 4 face-to-face meetings, which would be in various places around the world, so that basically people had to take turns to travel a long way. And they'll generally be like 3 days of meetings from like 10 in the morning until 6. With all of the meetings, we just put things on the agenda that are, any working group can say, right, I want this on the agenda. And then they just get organized by priority. But so, like, if I'm working on multi-col and I've got a bunch of issues, because I edit the multi-column layout spec, so I've got a bunch of issues, I can just agenda plus them. They'll get put on the agenda, and then they'll get discussed. So we sort of organize those ourselves. So for the big meetings, obviously we set up an agenda for all the days, because sometimes people might only be there for 1 day, and then we just work through them. And sometimes they're really quick. Sometimes they're just like, well, I think we should do this, and everyone will be like, yeah, I can't see any problem with that, and we'll just do it. And other times they could take, a whole day.
Okay.
So, and in terms of makeup, there's lots of browser vendor sort of engineers, obviously, people from browser vendors. There are a lot of people from the print industry. So because CSS is used to publish books, and EPUB uses CSS. So there's people representing that side of things. Quite a lot of them. You'd be surprised how much CSS is used in the print world. That's something I've done a fair bit of, is using CSS for book publishing. So there's those people. Then there are invited experts who are people like me, who do CSS stuff and have something to contribute. And we tend to be the people who've got the closest relationship with web developers, because either we are still web developers, or we write for web developers, or, we're teaching. And so we try and be, I think most of us who are invited experts try and be that link between the development community, and because a lot of browser engineers have not built websites. That's not what they do. They work on browser engines. So having that balance of what is possible to do in a browser and what is wanted by the community, that's quite good. And I think we've got that better at the moment than we've ever had. When I joined the CSS working group, it often felt like I was the only person really at a lot of meetings speaking for web developers, and now there's loads of people doing that, which I think is really positive.
Cool. I didn't notice that actually print people, let's say it like this, are heavily involved, and that CSS is really not only used for web stuff, right? So I didn't notice.
That's it. I mean, there's quite a lot of books are published using CSS. The page media spec is all about how you lay out books. So yeah, it's great fun. It is really good fun to do print stuff with CSS, because you've got this fixed canvas, and there's a whole bunch of stuff, for doing headers and footers and stuff in the margins that you have in a book. It's good fun to work with, actually.
Yeah. Also, do you organize the work like in a typical Scrum team, for example? Do you have sprints and retros like this, or is it like in a different way, Kanban mode, or is it something completely else?
It's very varied, because there are a few people who edit a huge amount of specs, so they're very busy and they tend to just be working on whatever's highest priority. Obviously, if people are employed by Google or Mozilla or what have you, they have time to work on this stuff. Those of us who are invited experts aren't paid to work on this stuff, so we do it when we have time. Sometimes people will pay an invited expert as a contractor to work specifically on a spec, so that happens. If for instance Google don't have anyone internally to work on a spec, but there's an invited expert who could do that work, then they might just contract them to do it. And so that occurs. And usually people will say that they're working on that spec on behalf of in the notes of the spec, if that's happening. But yeah, and I know that there's people like Igalia, the browser engineering company. They do a huge amount of work on code for different engines, and they have people who are on the CSS working group as well. And they're not tied to one browser engine. They actually do work on different platforms. So that's an interesting thing too.
Oh, cool. So, maybe one final question from me. Then I think we can end the session and go to some virtual socializing session. Now I forgot what was the question. No, the question was the question was, are there any secrets you wanna tell us? What's in the pipeline after container queries and masonry layout? Is there like a big backlog with stuff planned for the next years? Do you know of like similarly big features like those you mentioned, or?
Not really. I mean, anything that is kind of it sort of has any potential is listed in the repo as an issue, and you can poke through there. We don't really have secrets. Everything that any of the W3C things happen very much in the open. That's kind of how it works. So that's why everything's logged via our IRC. So yeah, there's not really secret features. I'm often surprised which things just suddenly take off, and I think it's because I'm not a browser engineer, and so I don't know. I've got a better idea these days, but I don't really know what is difficult to implement and what isn't. And so quite often features just suddenly land. I'm like, oh, that's cool. Where did that come from? Because it just happened that it wasn't a particularly difficult thing to do. And so once it was brought up, everyone was like, oh yeah, I could do that. and it just sort of happens. So yeah, it's very difficult to know how quickly, because it depends ultimately on, if things are getting implemented in browsers, it depends on their priorities, and they're just businesses. So they all have different priorities for their business as to what should get shipped. So to some extent, the actual implementation priorities are going to be led by browsers, because they're the ones who have to paying the money to write the code to put the thing in their engine. So, but yeah, I mean, you can poke around and see the sort of stuff that's being discussed. And things do move in priority based on feedback. If a lot of people are interested in something, it certainly does raise it to the top when it's like, well, what do we put in the next level of grid, for example, because, oh, well, everyone's asking for this thing. So that's probably a thing to talk about.
Cool. Josue, Katarzyna, do you have some final questions, comments?
Nothing. I learned a lot. Thank you very much for the talk. We hope to see you the next time in Germany. And a live session will be really cool.
Yeah, once I can leave the UK again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So let's meet in this Wondermill, maybe, huh?
Yeah. So for all the YouTube listeners, we just shared the link to a Wonderme, the virtual socializing room. Yeah, and feel free to connect with Rachel and with us there, and yeah, talk about web and other stuff a few minutes before we close the evening. So thanks for watching. Thanks, Rachel, again for your really total interesting talk, and see you soon after our summer break for our next event at Frontend RheinMain.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rachel. You're a very inspiring
Thank
person.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.